Superintendent's Conference Day. So we are moving along. I want to thank Dr. Westervelt and our teachers and our principals for all the work that they have done in getting, and our technology department in getting this program up and running and really working some of the issues through. So we're very happy with the way that's going. We do have two important presentations tonight. One of them is our annual audit report, and the second presentation, Dr. Westervelt will be reviewing our grades 3 through 8 state assessment results. And as Mrs. Sloan mentioned earlier, there are some additional discussions and building tours regarding the proposed bond, and we should have the dates of all of those tours up on the website. If they're not up tonight, they will definitely be up by tomorrow. So I will turn it over briefly to Ms. Fennick for the enrollment report.
Thank you, Dr. Mooney. As of October 1st, our student enrollment is 5,345. We, a difference of 18 students at the same time this last year, as of last year. Our student enrollment is still leveling off, and on our next agenda we'll have all the classes, if there are any, which they probably will be, over the class size limit for the board approval. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mooney and Ms. Fennick. I just make a motion for the approval of minutes, September 9, 2014. Ms. Johnson, all in favor? 6-0, thank you. And before I turn this over to Mrs. Callahan to introduce the auditors and the audit report, I would just like to thank both Mrs. Callahan and her staff for all of their hard work in helping to prepare everything that was needed, and Mr. McDermott for chairing the Audit Advisory Committee, and all the work that went into this for what we will hear tonight was an outstanding review. Thank you very much. And Ms. Callahan, I'll give it to you.
Thank you, Mrs. Sloan. I echo your comments. I have to thank my staff because they are the people on the front lines, and without a fabulous staff in the business office, this report would not be what it is. They work very hard to implement any recommendation of the auditors from the prior year. In addition, we also have internal auditors who look at various areas of the business operation and make recommendations for improvement that are also always immediately implemented. As Mrs. Sloan said, last week we had an opportunity to speak with the auditor through a conference call with our Community Audit Committee, which consists of 6 residents of the community, chaired by Mr. McDermott, and perhaps later he would like to speak a little bit more about that. We went over the management letter and some of the key findings in the audit. Our treasurer is here with us this evening, Rosemary Ruggiero, who does the audit, who really does, and I'm very lucky, certainly, to have her as a member of my staff, and she works very well, I believe, with the outside auditors, and we do have our friendly disagreements once in a while about, does this belong here, should this go there, but we always wind up in the end coming to a resolution that's always, I think, in the best interest of the district, but I will let the auditor speak to that. So I would like to introduce you to Tricia Lucas, who is the partner for Dark Angelo, who is the lead individual for the team who does our audit. They have been our auditor for approximately 5 years now. They're from upstate New York, I want to say Rome, Utica area. And they have several other Long Island clients, but generally when they come down here, we get very personal attention from them. So without further ado, Ms. Tricia Lucas of Dark Angelo.
Thank you, Mary. I'm going to go over the audited financial statements for the year ended June 30th of 2014. Did everybody get a copy of the financials?
Everyone got an electronic copy, and you were bringing hard copies,
I
right?
have hard copies. Does anybody need one? Thank you, Mary. So I'm happy to say for this year's audit, not only did it go very well, the district was very well prepared, everybody was very cooperative. We did perform interim field work along with year-end field work, so we came in, and I think it was May or June, and performed our interim field work, which focuses on your internal controls, some analytic review, the risk assessment, along with some board minutes. And then we came in and did our substantive procedures in August. And then from there, it goes into the report preparation process. The good news is there were no new accounting standards that had to be implemented this year. So basically, there's nothing that's inconsistent from prior years, no new accounting standards that significantly affected the financial statements. The district, in addition, had no significant and unusual transactions in the current year, such as bond refunding, which has occurred in the previous years. There is one new standard that I just want to make sure that everybody is aware that is upcoming. It's GASB 68. And what GASB 68 does is the two pension plans that the district is a participant in, they are not fully funded. Those two plans, the unfunded piece of those plans, the unfunded piece is going to be allocated to the district based on actuarial calculations, and that unfunded piece is going to be required to be put on the district's books in the upcoming year. So the plans themselves are going to have audits, which they typically do, but in addition, the unfunded piece is going to have to be allocated to each of the participants. So that is new and upcoming, and you can expect to hear about that next year during the audit. If you turn to page 1, these financial statements are the responsibility of the district. Our responsibility is to audit the financial statements and issue an opinion on them. So this is our independent auditor's report. If you go down to the section titled Opinions, you'll notice in the first sentence it says that your financial statements present fairly in all material respects, which means the district received an unmodified opinion or a clean opinion, which is what you're accustomed to receiving. The financial statements also include required supplementary information, which is referred to as RSI, which is required by the Governmental Accounting Standards Board. Those schedules are the management's discussion and analysis, the budgetary comparison schedules, and the funding progress of the OPEB. There is also other supplementary information that's included, which is required by the State Education Department. And then also there is an audit of your federal funds, and there's a schedule of federal expenditures in the back of the financial statement package that was just distributed. If you turn to page 5, this is the management's discussion and analysis. This is the only part of the financial statements that gives you comparative numbers. The rest of the financial statements, the actual face of the financial statements, are a single year presentation. So I'm going to focus here on the MD&A. On the top of page 5 gives you a chart of net position. The district had almost $106 million of total assets at the end of 14 versus $99 million in assets at the end of 13. You will see current and other assets increase by $4.7 million. That is due to an increase in cash at the end of the year. Capital assets increased approximately $2.3 million. At the end of the year, you had approximately $74 million in capital assets. You did have additions of $4.7 million. Most of that consisted of roofing projects throughout the district, and that was offset by depreciation expense of $2.3 million. You also had deferred outflows of resources of $280,000. It was a decrease of $40,000 from the previous year. That is the amortization of the amounts refunded, the difference between the bond refundings in the previous years, and that is going to be amortized at $40,000 every year. You had total liabilities of $138 million. Your current and other liabilities of $19.4 million did increase by $9.5 million. The TRS accrual at the end of the year increased by $2.6 million. In addition, you had an outstanding ban at the end of the year that you did not have in the previous year, and that was approximately $7 million. Your long-term liabilities increased $7.9 million. That increase was due to an increase in your OPEB liability of $12 million, offset by bonds payments of $4 million. Your long-term liabilities, which are almost $19 million, consist of bonds of $40 million, your OPEB liability of $73 million, workers' comp of $2 million, compensated absences of $1.7 million, and then an energy performance contract of $1.5 million. The OPEB liability of the $73.3 million, that is the liability that you're required to put on your books. It was GASB 45 was implemented approximately 5-6 years ago, and that is a liability for the retiree health insurance that the district is obligated to. That liability is being amortized onto your books over a 30-year period, and at this point in time, you have $73 million on your books. Your net position is a deficit of $32.3 million. That consists of net investments in capital assets of almost $29 million. That is your buildings, your fixed assets, your equipment, your vehicles, offset by depreciation and the related debt. You had restricted net position of $5.5 million. That consisted of the reserves. And then you had an unrestricted deficit of $66.4 million. Keep in mind, you do have $73.3 million of OPEB liability on your books, and that is what is pushing you into that deficit position. If you turn to page 6, in the middle of the page, it details out your revenues and expenses for the 2 years in comparative format. You had $143 million in revenues in 2014 versus $139.4 million in 2013. You will notice your property taxes and STAR increased by $4 million, and that was offset by operating grants. In addition, you had an increase in operating grants of $500,000. Most of that was attributable to additional monies in the special ed and the English language grant money. Those were offset by a decrease in other revenues, which decreased almost $600,000. That was due to a BOCES refund that was received in the prior year that was not received in the current year. That was a one-time large refund. Your expenses increased from $147.3 million to $153.6 million, or $6.3 million. You will notice $6 million of that is in the instruction line, which is expected because that's where most of your salaries and benefits and your contractual obligations are. So that is the line item that you would expect to see increase over the year. You will notice that your debt service unallocated interest did decrease by $175,000. That is due to the bond refundings in the previous year and just the pay down of the debt service on an annual basis. Total change in net position was $10.4 million. If you turn to page 9 next, this gives you a financial analysis of the district's fund balances. You will notice at the end of 2014, you had $10.7 million in fund balance. That is an accumulation of all funds. In the general fund, you had a little over $14 million. $5.4 million of that was restricted. Almost $3 million was in the retirement contribution reserve, which is approximately 1 year's worth of expense, of ERS expense. And you will notice that decreased by $1.4 million. That was used in the current year. The employee benefit accrued liability was approximately $1.4 million. Your compensated absences is $1.7 million, so you are well within the limits of that reserve. You did appropriate almost $4 million for the subsequent year budget, and at the end of 14, you had almost $3 million in unassigned fund balance. That is 2.06% of the 14-15 year budget, and you are allowed to have 4%, so you are well within the limits of the 4% compliance requirement. Your total general fund balance was a little over $14 million, which is approximately 10% of your budget. If you please turn to page 28. I just want to point out a couple key disclosures. The very top of page 28, this gives you your future changes in accounting standards. This is where you'll find that GASB 68 is going to be required in the upcoming year. It is a note in the financial statements, and it is new for the current year, so I just wanted to point that out. If you turn to page 32, page 32 gives you detail on both your short-term and long-term debt. Note 9, your short-term debt, you will notice this is where you can see your band disclosed that we talked about that are within your current liabilities. You did take a TAN out during the year, but that was issued and paid within the year. The band was taken out, and it was due 8/8 of 14, but it was outstanding at the end of the year of $6,975,000. Note 10 does detail out your long-term debt, which we just talked about, which was the serial bonds, your OPEB, workers' comp, and the EPC contract. If you'll now turn to page 34. Again, your current liabilities increased from 13 to 14. One of the more significant reasons was an increase in the TRS accrual. At the bottom of page 34, you will see that the TRS expense increased from $6.9 million in 2013 to $9.6 million in 2014. So your TRS expense went up $2.7 million from year to year. Page 35. This is the OPEB note, where it discloses the actuarial calculations of your post-retirement benefits that you're obligated to. Again, at the end of the year, there was $73.3 million on your books, but if you go to letter E at the bottom, the actuaries are projecting that your total liability at this point in time is $200 million. So while you've accumulated on your books $73.3 million, over the next 25 years, you'll be amortizing in the rest of that, and ultimately you will have the $200 million on your books as a total liability for OPEB. If you turn to page 39, this gives you budget and actual numbers with a variance column all the way to the right for the general fund on a standalone basis. The numbers that we went over previously were on a GASB 34 presentation, which consolidates all funds and does include both your fixed assets and your long-term debt. So this is the general fund on a standalone basis. You will notice for revenues, you budgeted $137.6 million. You ended up getting in $138.1 million. So approximately $600,000 over budget, which is only 0.4% over budget. Your expenses, you budgeted $139.3 million. and you only had $18,000 left over at the end of the year. So unlike previous years, this year it was extremely tight with what was spent during the year compared to your budget. That is 0.013% variance to budget. The next page I would like to review is page 44. This starts the single audit portion of your financial statements. There are two reports included in the single audit. One is the independent auditor's report on internal control over financial reporting and compliance. I'm happy to report in both reports, the first one and the second one, which is the independent auditor's report on compliance for each major program. There were no significant deficiencies or material weaknesses noted that needed to be reported in the financial statements themselves. In addition, you got an unmodified opinion, which once again is the highest level of opinion you can receive, otherwise referred to as a clean opinion. If you turn to page 47, this details out your federal funds that were spent throughout the year. You spent $2.3 million in federal funds, which does exceed the threshold of $500,000, which triggers a single audit. They are raising that threshold in future years to $750,000, but unfortunately you're still over that threshold and you will need, a single audit in the upcoming years as well. This year, we did test the special education program, which is approximately $1.2 million of the 2.3. If you turn to page 49, this does give you a summary of the auditor's results. Once again, you received an unmodified or a clean opinion. There were no significant deficiencies or no material weaknesses noted. The box at the bottom of page 49 where it says low risk auditee, I always just like to point that out. Port Washington was considered a low-risk auditee, which means for the most part you've had clean auditor's reports in the past 2 years. There are other criteria, but that's the most significant. And that means that you only have to have 25% of your federal funds audited. Now, we did test more than 25% because that program came up in the rotation, but it is nice to know that you qualify as a low-risk auditee. Any questions on the financial statements?
Observation, shall we say?
Sure.
You talked about the reserves on page 9.
Yes.
That's the one you're missing. Yeah, sorry. I need my packet didn't have page 9. You mentioned, and just so everybody's clear, we have an upper limit as to what % we can have in our unrestricted balance. And could you just explain that a little more?
Sure. It's actually it's the unassigned.
Unassigned, I'm sorry.
That's okay. It's the unassigned line. The unassigned balance should not exceed 4% of the subsequent year's budget. So you are sitting at 2% of the 14-15 budget at this point in time.
Now, I've asked you this question in years past, and we see that our reserves have been decreasing because we've been taking out over the past few years to hold the budget increases down and within the tax cap. How does our percentage and our absolute amount in the reserve compare to other districts, and what are your conclusions regarding that?
Are you talking fund balance in total for the general fund or your unassigned?
Unassigned.
Unassigned. It does vary greatly from district to district. Some districts still have very strong reserves left. Other districts have no reserves left. So I would say you're probably right in the middle at this point. You did use almost $1.5 million of your ERS reserve. A lot of districts at this point in time have upwards to 2 to 3 times the ERS expense in that reserve.
I'm sorry, say that again, I didn't quite hear you.
The ERS reserve,
Right.
right now you're sitting at approximately 1 year's worth of expense. We are seeing that reserve at most districts with at least 2 to 3 years worth of expense in that reserve.
Would that be your recommendation, that would be the amount of reserve that would be appropriate?
That is a great reserve to have. You always know that you're going to have that ERS expense, and it is it's a very flexible reserve. You don't need voter approval to put money in, and you don't need voter approval to take it out. There are no specified limits on the reserve. General municipal law does state reasonable amounts.
Okay. Now I have a couple more. If
Okay.
we turn to page, I don't need yours for this one, Larry. Page 3. Now, actually not page 3. Yeah, the state and local revenues. It seems to me that the state and federal aid that we get represents a continually decreasing part of our budget. And is that something, how does our district stack up in comparison to others that you've audited throughout the state?
This year, some of the districts we saw did have an increase in state aid due to the gap elimination adjustment, but we are seeing districts struggling with the decrease in aid.
Are other districts or comparable districts receiving state and federal aid at about 5%, as we are, at the same time as our mandates are going up every year?
Yes, all districts are experiencing the same thing. The 5% I cannot attest to because I don't have that information, I guess, at hand. But yes, many districts are seeing the challenges of decreasing aid while increasing mandated expenses.
Not holding you to exact figures, and I'm not trying to sandbag you in any way, I'm really not. But is the 5% figure that we're getting, is that on the low side, the average side, or the high side for representative districts?
That, I apologize, but I'm not sure of at this point in time. I can definitely look that, I can
Yes,
do some analysis for you.
And could you send us that information? I think
Absolutely.
that'd be very valuable.
Yep,
Thank you.
you're welcome.
Oh, that's even better.
I simply wanted to say that state aid, generally speaking, is based on property wealth and income. So we are definitely on the high side of both values, therefore on the low side of receiving state aid.
I just want some indication of where we fall on the spectrum so that everybody in the audience and the community can understand this. Because again, something I'll be bringing up later today, we're going to get hit next year with another mandate that's going to cost us some more money, and we're not getting any money to pay for it. So everything is a stretch, and frankly, all these mandates are putting such strain on us, it becomes almost unworkable. It really is.
And I would just like to clarify, the new GASB standard that is up and coming, it is a book entry only, and it's not something you're going to be able to fund.
That's
Okay, I didn't know if that's what you're
that's a
referring
different
to.
issue. I understand that.
Okay.
But I'm trying to, reduce, to some elemental discussions here. And this is one that's really hitting home when you see an audit report that states that our whole aid package is $7 million, and yet last year, or 2 years ago with APPR, Common Core, it's adding millions of dollars to costs, and we're not only are we not seeing any benefits of it, it's just taking more dollars out of our primary role.
Okay, first of all, I'd like to thank you for the report and for your explanation of it. It's very concise, so that I appreciate it. And I'd like to thank Mary and her team for making your life easy and doing such a good job with it. I have a couple of questions. I'm on page 9 as well. And my question is under the, where is it? Under the Capital Projects Fund, we have a negative reserve. Is that just due to the bonding?
Yes.
Okay.
That is actually disclosed on page 38, and it
Okay.
is just due to temporary financing at this point in time.
Okay, then I have one more question on page 35. It shows that we were supposed to, according to the OPEB, make contributions of $17 million, and we made contributions of $5.5 million. So are we falling further behind each year? Is that what that indicates, or is that just sort of like some plug number that goes in and doesn't really mean much?
The $17 million not only represents the normal cost of the year, but it also includes the cost of the amortization that you're making up for previous years to get up to that $200 million.
Okay. And my general question is, I mean, our total income went up 2.7% and our total expenses went up 4.3%. Based upon the fact that we now have an upper limit to what we can increase as revenue each year, and we don't have an upper increase of what our expenses can go up each year, do we have, and we have a constitutional obligation to provide a quality education to every child in our district, do we have a sustainable model that can actually exist for the next 25 years?
Not at that rate, Larry.
Thank you. He said it best. No, not at that rate.
Okay, so at some point that will start affecting our unqualified opinions, because at some point we will not be able to do the job which we are required by law to do.
You're still going to have to produce a balanced budget, and I don't think it's going to affect the opinion that we issue, but yes, something's going to have to give in the future. You're right.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Can I ask, do you have an estimate, for example, this year along the expenses of what the TRS contribution will be this year, the percentage?
I think it came out. Do you recall, Mary? Thank you.
That's why I was asking if you would glean that. I know the ERS number too.
So that should be coming out shortly.
Right.
Hi. Hello.
How are you?
Good, thanks.
It's always nice to hear an upstate accent every once in a while. Is there a threshold number, lower threshold number in the unreserved balance or the unassigned balance or the reserves that would give us a negative report or a negative, like not a clean report or a negative opinion? A percentage.
So in other words, if your unassigned went negative,
Or if it went to 1%.
no, that would not affect the auditor's opinion.
Okay. And the next level of, so we have a clean auditor's report right now, which gave us 25% that we had to do. At the next level, if you had to do more, what percentage is it?
It would be 50%.
And that would increase the amount of time and expense to the district, I'm guessing?
It would definitely increase the amount of audit time needed.
Okay.
As you can see, we tested, actually, I think we tested 50% this year because the special education program needed to be tested, and it was in excess of 50% of total funds.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome.
Oh, go ahead.
Hi.
Hello.
The OPED is a fascinating entry on the books because it sort of indicates that in theory you're bankrupt, but you're really not because it's a book entry.
Correct.
From the corporate side, we would make these entries quarterly and annually for things like vacation accruals, and then you would reverse them out as they were expensed. The 199 million is really a theoretical value. If we were to shut down, that would be our long-term exposure. But if we stay in business sort of for the next 100 years, we will amortize this fully on our books and then just keep paying our current amount that the state bills us every year. And provided, if employee count stays constant, but longevity or life expectancy increases, the amount just automatically will increase every year because of that trend.
Yes, in addition to the increased cost of health care.
Right. But it is not a liability of the district today. It is the liability in theory over the next 50 years, for argument's sake.
Correct.
Okay.
I'm not so sure that's correct, even though you said it's right. That is a liability that we have today. It's a long-term liability, but we owe that money based on the actuary's estimate. It's
But
a
you
real
can't,
liability.
I interpret it as you're not funding it. So
Right.
it's-
We're going to fund that money over the next 50 years.
You're on a pay-as-you-go basis.
Right.
So
So
it's an actual
like a mortgage.
liability.
It's like a mortgage.
but you're not going to pay it.
And your mortgage is getting bigger, and your annual payments are getting higher to pay for the bigger mortgage.
Yes, but the 199 is there, but it's not a realistic number. We will pay $15 million a year for the next 50 years, so we will pay $200 million or $300 million that has no relation to the 199 million.
No, I would characterize it as if it's like a mortgage on your house, like a $200 million house, right? And the next year, they tell you your mortgage is now $210 million. And then your your payments go up.
But it's an amount that never gets paid. Like a mortgage, you actually have to pay down to zero. The 200 million will never be paid down to zero. It will sit on the books forever for the next, if we were in a school district for the next 500 years, that amount may eventually be $1 billion because that's just what it'll get to. But it's an amount that never gets paid other than the fiscal amount that's for that single year line item in your
Correct.
budget.
Yep.
Right, and the state isn't billing us. So you were saying, all of this is really just insurance premiums. This is all health insurance premiums.
Well, but it's the future cost of insurance premium. It's for someone who's going to retire in 30 years, who just started in the district and has a life expectancy of 90, and they've calculated that and put that in the 199 million. So we are putting on our books 70 years worth of expense as an arbitrary audit number. Not an audit number, but it's an arbitrary number that's calculated and added to our books.
Correct.
Okay.
Just to keep adding, sorry. I just have to keep going with this. You know, the point is, for me, is that every year, this may be a fantasy number that you never have to actually pay, as if you had kind of like a interest-only mortgage or something you never have to pay off. But in our budget, we have $17 million approximately that we pay out every year, and that number gets bigger and bigger. If you just looked at only people who've retired, right, of that $200 million of long-term liability that we have, maybe it's $74 million is their calculation, the number that you never have to pay, right? But every year we're paying over $5 million for that. And that number only gets bigger and bigger. So if you wanted to understand how much more money would we have to have put in the bank this year in order to cover the increase in liability that we're going to eventually pay pieces of, it's about $4 million. And you can never pay it, but you're always going to pay a little bit of it. You want me to? No, I'm not turning mine off.
And I understand that, but what you're talking about then is pre-funding the long-term liability.
No, I'm not talking about
That for that retired group, the 74 million, it's their entire medical cost over their entire retirement for 20 or 30 years. There is one person, I jokingly looked at the chart that you had, and there's one man in the 95 to 99 bucket. It happens to be my uncle, and I happen to know it because he's 99, and so, or he's now 100. But we've amortized his expense into that number. We've amortized the entire bucket into that number. That 74 million we will pay over forever. It's an infinity calculation. Yes, if you want to talk about the 17 million as being a problem that we face that keeps going up, or the retirement amount, yes. But the 200 million is not an issue that we will grapple with in our lifetime. It just isn't. The increasing amount year over year over year, 2 million, 1 million, 3 million in retirement benefits, those are real numbers. But the 200 will be 220, will be 230, will be 250, come back in 15 years, it'll be 300 million. It's just like the new entry you're going to make, that whatever, 45, it'll do the same thing. In a sense, every school district in the state of New York is insolvent based on that entry into its books, because their debt will exceed their total tax revenue. slowly. It already does. It's probably the same on every district you audit.
It
that-
is.
That the debt that you're entering is greater than their entire year's tax revenue.
It is.
So if you look at that as being insolvent, every school district in the state of New York is insolvent based on that entry, which is not practical in a sense. It's a way to record it for audit purposes, but not for day-to-day operation.
No, it's okay. It's okay. I get what you're saying, Ellen, Vern, you too. But I'm going to return to the prior theme because, and you may not have these answers too. And
Okay.
if you don't, if you can provide them, or Mary may be able to. But we're returning to the state aid theme and the unfunded mandates and how much it costs versus how much we're getting. And do you have any, have you broken out the difference or the costs between the necessary, what it costs us to have the necessary programs versus the ones that truly are not necessary per state guidelines?
I have not done that
Okay,
analysis.
if you haven't,
Typically, that's not something that we do.
We have discussed many times, though, the mandated versus non-mandated programming, and actually do have the dollars attached to that. Is that what you're asking?
that's part of it. I'm just trying to, again, reinforce the point that the dollars we're getting are dwindling and the monies we're spending are inflating. And it's happening all the time. And again, this is something else that is unsustainable.
All right.
Just to follow up on that, if the mandates that we have to follow that do not provide educational benefit to our students exceed $7.7 million, then we are probably not being prudent by accepting the aid and by not just going off on our own, educating the children with 100% local money and just doing what we want and saving the $15 million of sort of useless mandates that we're being told to do. We'd have a net increase of $8 million to the good, which would let us go along with the tax cap another few years at least. So I think that's something we should seriously consider and seriously look at, whether we just want to withdraw from the system and just fund ourselves locally and just educate our children as we see fit, which is our constitutional mandate. The Constitution does not require that we do it under the guidance of the State Education Department.
Another question?
Yeah, back to the reserves, because it's a key focus long-term for the district, not the OPED reserve.
Okay.
We finished that one. But do you chart at all as an organization all of the school districts you audit and produce any kind of annual overview for the different reserve buckets that actually say across your 40 or 50 school districts, when you look at workman's comp, cost to reserve, like you had said, some school districts on the ERS have 2 or 3 times. Do you have any sort of matrix that you keep in general as an organization on the whole bucket?
No, that isn't something that we chart at all for all of our districts. All the districts are very different in nature as far as some may have a capital project going on and have a $10 million capital reserve, but that may be gone in 2 years because the capital project has been completed. Your typical reserves are the employee benefit accrued liability reserve, which cannot exceed your compensated absences liability. So depending on how your contracts read, what your compensated absence balance is, typically most schools have the max in the EBLR reserve. The ERS reserve is another very popular reserve. And again, we are seeing the districts that have a little bit of additional, I shouldn't say additional funding, some money to put into reserves. They are utilizing that ERS reserve. Workers' comp, unemployment, those types of reserves, it's a school-by-school basis depending on their needs and how they're structured. And then you also have like the repair reserve, which is very restrictive. Not a lot of schools utilize that reserve. and then the tax cert reserve, which you won't have either.
Okay. And in the sense of an audit opinion, even if we had $1 in each one of the reserves, provided that you went through and did your testing and did the analysis of the in and out flow of money, the audit report would basically look the same, because you're not giving, in a sense, an educational audit of the financial structure, but more the financial structure of the district complying with state law in the sense of how we have to run our books.
Correct.
Right. So, I mean, that would follow sort of Larry's and Bill's comments that we could be educationally crumbling, but fiscally the house is in order.
Correct. This is just a financial analysis.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I believe, oh, Mary, yes.
I simply did want to go back to my favorite page, which is page 9, which shows all the reserves and the total assigned and unassigned, because Mrs. Nadolny asked a question earlier regarding the unassigned, which this year is $2.9 million for those who don't have a document in front of them. And last year, our total unassigned on a lower budget was $4.6 million. Last year, when we had 4.6, which was close to our 4% maximum that we were allowed, we had some additional monies in revenue that we also were able to add into our reserves. I am just calling to your attention that this year, on a higher budget, we have $2.9 million of unassigned money left. We had no funds to put into any of these reserves, unemployment, retirement contribution, and so on. And the board did agree in the budget process that we are appropriating for next year $3.9 million, which does show on this page. Next year, when that $3.9 million is gone, and whatever other changes may take place, our total general fund will move down from 14 million to a maximum of 10 million if we are there. And to Mrs. Nadolny's question, for auditing purposes, it will still be a clean audit, but the comptroller's office has always received copies of these audits, but they have now begun a statewide comparative issue, and they will designate districts that are in, quote, fiscal stress. And that is all because of the tax levy limit cap that is forcing districts to spend down any reserves that they have in order to maintain program. And as Tricia has said, there are some districts who are in far worse condition, and all of us business officials and superintendents are watching to see what happens when they get to the point that they no longer can fund their program, when they have cut their staffing and don't have sufficient revenues to meet their payrolls.
There was a report that they have no reserves left. Oh, no reserves left whatsoever. I don't want, speaking personally, I don't want to get to that point. I mean, I think that's and I'm sure, yeah, Karen, I'm sure no one does. So I think the advanced planning that in particular Alan's been doing, and the other members of the budget committee, I think that's very important, because we don't want to hit that precipice. Really don't.
I think we will end our discussion on the audit with the chair of our audit advisory committee. Mr. McDermott, I believe you have some comments?
I would love to, Karen. Thank you very much. I just want to say that I'm so pleased with all the engaging questions that the board was asking, and so pleased with how the audit went this year, and what a lovely unqualified opinion, and everything was great. I want to also say I feel so bad for WAFA because a good audit committee meeting is just such a tough act to follow. I don't know how you're going to hold our attention, but I hope you can. I do want to say that Ira's been tutoring me actually after school for a little stand-up. Obviously, it was just the beginning of my training. I want to thank Mary and the business office for doing a great job. Again, this is my third year involved with the audit committee, and it's so wonderful and clean, and everything that the external and internal auditors suggest is addressed promptly to everyone's satisfaction. And it's a wonderful, it seems like there's such a great relationship between the business unit and the auditors, both external and internal. Rosemary, you're amazing. Thank you for all the great help during all the committee meetings. And Grace Chan also, big contributor. But the whole business office, like Mary said before. Tricia, thank you very much. You've educated me a great deal over the last 3 years, and I appreciate it. And it's always fantastic to hear you to go through the finances. So thanks again, and like I said, WAFA, good luck.
Thank you.
And WAFA, we'll turn it over to you now.
Okay, good evening. More numbers, in case you haven't had enough. As you are well aware, the 2013-14 school year was the second year during which our children across New York State were tested in both English language arts and mathematics, and those exams happened to be aligned with the new Common Core learning standards. Just as a quick reminder, the New York State exams are rated with 4 levels, 4 performance levels: level 1, level 2, level 3, and level 4. And level 4 happens to be the highest level that a child can get on either the ELA or the math, and it happens to indicate that a child excels in the standards for English language arts and or mathematics. Level 3 is what is defined as proficient in the standards. Level 2 is partially proficient, and level 1, the lowest level, is well below proficient. In looking at our performance for the past 2 years, as you may recall, prior to the 12-13 school year, the children were assessed on the old New York State standards. But for the past 2 years, as I mentioned before, we were looking at assessments that were much more rigorous, much more difficult, lengthier reading passages, more complicated mathematics problems, again, aligned with the Common Core standards. So when you look at our grades 3 through 5 performance for the district, you will note that we have shown incremental progress in 13-14 as compared with the 12-13 school year. Looking at math, you will again see comparable results where, again, we've shown incremental progress. When you look at the research, the research consistently shows that incremental progress is what you are able to sustain. Sometimes you have districts that implement a very prescriptive program, and they may see a 20 or 30 percentage point jump in 1 year, and then the following year they decline significantly because those kinds of jumps in performance are very, very difficult to sustain. So again, incremental progress in each of the grade levels. For Weber, when you take a look at grades 6, 7, and 8 ELA, again, you will note that there's been some improvement, with the exception of grade 7, and I will come back to that in a few moments. In looking at the mathematics for Weber, again, you will note that, again, there has been improvement in 13-14 as compared with with the 12-13 school year. Yeah. We did look at our data in relation to New York State, and across the board, for all 3 through 8, both ELA and math, we were consistently above New York State. So for grade 3, you can see the difference and the amount of, the percentage points that we are above the state. Grade 4, grade 5. You can see that for New York State, the percent of children who achieved levels 3 and 4 across the board, the percentage was fairly low. Same thing with the middle level. Now, as I noted before, for grade 7 ELA, you will note that our performance there was much lower in comparison to the other grade levels. When you look at the performance for New York State on the grade 7 ELA, it was the lowest of all of the exams. And actually, when I also looked at Nassau County, grade 7 consistently was the lowest throughout the county. And part of the reason, I think it's important to keep in mind that the ELA exams are really very heavily science and social studies content-based. It's also important to keep in mind that they are timed. So although, in theory, we are assessing children's ability to read and comprehend and interpret information, we are doing so with a limited amount of time that they are given to complete each test. The Common Core assessments, in comparison to the prior ones, have much lengthier passages. They have more sophisticated vocabulary, and also the content that the children are required to read and again interpret and comprehend and respond to is very heavily embedded in science and social studies content. And so how a child relates to that content can certainly make a difference in how they perform on a given exam. Grade 8 ELA, you can see that we showed a 27% improvement from the prior year. That you can see that the 27 percentage point difference between our performance and the performance of children across New York State. The grade 4 science, children take a mandated exam in science only in grades 4 and 8. It is not given in grades 3 through 8, as are the ELA and mathematics. And as you can see, we do very, very well on the 4th grade and again on the 8th grade, which I will get to momentarily. Again, the performance levels for math, the definitions are fairly consistent with those of the ELA. So again, in looking at, in comparing 2013-14 with 12-13, you can see that again, we have shown some improvement, and those improvements are incremental and vary from grade to grade. And you can see again, we are well above New York State, and actually, as I mentioned before, we are well above Nassau County on all of these exams. If you recall from last year's presentation, 8th grade math, along with 7th grade math, happened to be two of our highlights. One of the reasons that we have shown a decrease in the 8th grade math in 13-14 as compared with 12-13 is that we have many, many students, in fact 108 of them this past year, who are in advanced mathematics. In the past, those children took the 8th grade math exam, but they also took the integrated algebra regents. However, in 13-14, the state introduced the Common Core algebra regent exam in addition to the traditional regent exam, and therefore state had said those children who are in advanced mathematics and are taking algebra do not need to take the 8th grade exam. So 108 of our 8th graders last year participated in the Common Core algebra, and in the traditional algebra exam, and therefore did not take the 8th grade assessments. 8th grade science, 83% at proficiency levels 3 and 4. Okay. Now, we did look at our data in relation to neighboring districts, and you'll note that I made a notation there that neighboring districts do not necessarily mean similar districts. Because we are a North Shore district, we are often compared with our neighbors that are mentioned above, Great Neck, Jericho, Manhasset, and so on. However, it's important to keep in mind that a neighboring district does not necessarily mean that the district is similar in terms of size of the district, in terms of demographics, in terms of the percentages of children who are on free and or reduced lunch, or in terms of the percentage of English language learners. So when we looked at our neighboring districts, you will see notations there where in quite a few cases we did outperform our neighbors, which had not been the case the prior year. So we know that when the first Common Core exams were given back in 2012, 2013, that all districts throughout the state of New York had seen a significant drop in performance. And as we know, that drop in performance did not indicate and did not mean that our children were doing less well. What it really meant was that the exams were much more difficult, much more rigorous, as I mentioned before, and we've talked about this, in many different settings. We've talked about it at our curriculum committee meetings. We've talked about it at other data presentations when we looked at our test scores. The exams became much more harder, and not only that, but the range of scores and the whole scoring system was actually changed by New York State. So a level 3 in 2012-2013 and 2013-2014 did not equate to a level 3 back in 11-12 or prior years. So the whole rating system had been changed. I mentioned before that 108 of our children were in advanced, 108 of our Weber children in 2013-14 were in advanced mathematics and took the integrated algebra and the Common Core algebra exam. I'm very proud to say that 100% of those children achieved levels 3 and 4 on the Regent exam. We also had 173 of those 8th graders who are in advanced science take the Earth Science Regent rather than the 8th grade science assessments, and 100% of them achieved levels 3 and 4. We know that one set of data does not paint a full picture. We know that the state exams tend to change from year to year. The scoring and the ranges of the scores tend to change. So oftentimes we're really, although we do look at longitudinal data and we do compare one year with a prior year, we're not always comparing apples to apples. So as a district, we do look at other sources of data that help us to know and to see where our children are and how well we are doing. As I'm sure you're all aware, we administer the Northwest Evaluation Association, NWEA's assessments, which are called MAPS, M-A-P-S, Measures of Academic Progress. When we looked at that data, we could see that when we compared our children who took the NWEA in the spring of 2014, which is the time when the state exams are administered, in comparison to everyone who takes the NWEA. And by the way, the NWEA assessments, they're actually international assessments, so we're not just comparing ourselves to New York State, but we are comparing ourselves to the millions and millions of children who take the NWEA assessments. As you know, we administer them in reading and in mathematics, and you can see that when you look at our grades 3, 4, and 5, our mean score for NWEA far surpasses the mean score of the population, the international population that takes those assessments. Now, the rating system and the grading system is very different than that of New York State. However, there is a correlation. NWEA does what they call linking studies. They do them every few years, and they look at the assessments for individual states. In our case, they do look at the assessments for New York State, and they do look at the scoring ranges for New York State, and they do a linking study to determine how closely correlated or how predictive are NWEA scores in relation to New York State. And what they have found in their last linking study, which I believe was done in 2013, is that there is a strong correlation. The scores in NWEA are reported by what's called the RIT, R-I-T, which stands for Roush, the man who actually developed this grading system, the Roush unit scale. And the NWEA scale is an equal interval scale. So again, as you can see for grades 3, 4, and 5 in reading, the mean scores are up there for you, and those mean scores are above those grade levels. They are not even on grade level. They're well above grade level. Same thing in mathematics for the NWEA. And when we look at the middle level, again, you will see that we have well surpassed the overall NWEA mean score for each of those grade levels. So just as a reminder, for those who are interested in more information on how to read and interpret the New York State exams, as well as to take a look at New York State for the 13-14 exams actually released 50% of each grade level's questions, and they annotated the questions. So that's all available on Engage New York. The website is up there for you. The annotated questions not only break down and deconstruct the question and what it's actually asking of children, but they also deconstruct the responses that are not correct and provide an explanation as to why they are incorrect, and at the same time provide an explanation for the correct responses. As I previously mentioned, we have seen incremental progress, and everyone is continuing to work very, very hard for the benefit of our children. As we all know, it takes every one of us to really work for our children and to continue to make the progress that we have just seen. And I just wanted to take a moment to thank the board, because with everything that we did last year, certainly in terms of professional development, certainly in terms of bringing in consultants who worked with our teachers on both the ELA Common Core and so many other things that we've talked about in the past that were done, none of it would be possible without the support of the board and certainly without the support of the community. So I just wanted to take a moment to thank everyone and to say that we are forging ahead, and we will continue to work toward progress. So, thank you.
I recorded that, just so you know.
Dr. Westervelt, I just want to thank you very much for that comprehensive presentation, and you did a great job following the auditors. I just have to say, it's my personal bias. I prefer that over the numbers, but thank you. It was wonderful, and I believe, Chris, do you want to start the questions?
Thank you. I do have to applaud. You've done a wonderful job for the district thus far. A couple questions, though, and I'm sorry that I didn't give them to you ahead of time. The first of which, because you showed that the 7th grade ELA was lower than in the past, it got me to thinking about it specifically. The ELA, is it mostly written, like not fill in the blank type thing? It's mostly short answer, long answer questions?
It's actually a combination. There are multiple choice questions of varying difficulty, and then there are short responses, written responses that children have to provide, and then also extended responses. And
these are graded by other teachers?
Yeah, we have, in the past, what we have done is we've had committees of teachers who, there's training involved. So we have what's called lead trainers and lead scorers. They attend trainings at BOCES, grade, for each grade level. And then the morning of the beginning of each scoring day, they do turnkey scoring. However, last year we did partial online scoring. Our own teachers went to BOCES and were able to score the exams. They were electronic, they were scanned in, and they were able to score them in that regard. So the answer is yes. They are graded by a group of teachers based on a rubric that is created and developed by New York State.
So in that aspect of it, are they looking mostly for content, not necessarily spelling or punctuation or anything else like that, or are they looking for a whole answer?
So it varies. For the short, or what's called the constructed response, it's more about the content and did the child respond to the question that is being presented. When you get to the extended response, which is really more of an essay type of response, where children have to link a fiction and a nonfiction passage, and they're very complex, by the way, and there are bulleted items they have to address in their responses. You are grading for conventions, which include spelling and grammar, but you are also grading for content.
So do we get that information broken down as far as whether or not they got the content, but their punctuation and stuff was off, or is it just a matter of they didn't get that question right?
It's based on a rubric. So if you have a 4-point rubric, a child can achieve 0 through 4. So we do have information that will tell us the score that the child achieved, but in order to know exactly why, we'd have to go back to each individual child's exam. Well, the completed exams by law we have to keep for 1 year. Any unused test booklets we are required to return. They actually do inventory, and there is a specific count that we receive, and we're required to return any unused. We're no longer permitted to hold on to any unused test booklets. The completed ones we must hold on to for 1 year by law.
My personal opinion is I would like to see where we're lacking. Is it they get the content, but they're not capitalizing and putting periods, or if it's a combination of that. As far as broken down, I know that like the tests were under huge scrutiny last year, and Commissioner King had said that they were going to make some different accommodations for special ed and ELL learners. Did they actually do that, and did we see a difference?
No, English language learners and students with disabilities have accommodations, and they have extended time. However, the tests have not been modified. So there are no differentiated assessments. They are all the same for every child. We do have data. They do, because of No Child Left Behind, and if you look at prior New York State report cards, the accountability, everything is reported by subgroups. So yes, we did look at the performance of, all of our general education, our students with disabilities, English language learners. Yeah, we do have the availability of that data, and we did take a look at it.
And although this is not totally related, but somewhat, the NWEA, that is being administered to K through 8 or 12? K through 8. And there was an email that went around that talked about the fact that it's being administered 6 times per year, 3 for ELA, 3 for math. Is that correct?
So last year, the exam was administered 3 times. So each child participates in the reading comprehension portion and in the mathematics portion. So technically for each child, yes. We are, however, having conversations for this year and are considering reducing the administration only to fall and spring, but a final decision has not yet been made.
Okay, I also want to thank you for all of the work and for your presentation, and I'm sorry I didn't get these to you in advance. There may be some questions that you can't answer, which is fine. I accept an I don't know as being, as at least a 2 out of 4. So, and my questions are not like in any great order, so I'm just going to go with them. In your opinion, are the tests truly aligned with the standards? Because the way I understand it, the standards allow for a lot of curricular variability, but the tests are based on certain curricula. So are they, for example, like in math, where according to the standard you can solve problems in many different ways, according to the test you can only solve problems in one way. So are the tests a true measure of the standards? Oh.
So there are, as you know, there are many standards for both English language arts and for mathematics. And although we teach to all the standards, all of them are not necessarily tested on every grade level and on every exam. And so sometimes from year to year, you might have more emphasis on a particular standard or a particular set of standards than on others. I do believe that the tests do assess the Common Core standards. I think it's sometimes the level of difficulty of the question. Sometimes, quite honestly, it's not that they're not aligned to the standards, but a question may be poorly worded. Or sometimes the choices on, for example, on the multiple choice component, the choices may be confusing, not only to the children, sometimes the choices are confusing to the adults. So I do think they are aligned with the Common Core standards, but again, not all standards are assessed on every exam. And Larry, I just want to, if you don't mind, I just want to add one other thing. Children can actually demonstrate their knowledge of mathematics in more than one way on the exams. Again, it depends on the type of question. There are questions, what I referred to earlier with the ELA, the constructed response, where children have to not only come up with the correct answer, but they have to demonstrate how they got their answer. And sometimes it changes from year to year what state ed will accept as a viable process. So a child may actually use strictly pictures to demonstrate how they calculated or how they derived at that answer. Another child might use a different way. They do get credit because keeping in mind that with the mathematics standards, there are 8 standards of mathematical practices that are consistent from grade level to grade level. They are the same. And then, of course, you have the domain-specific standards that are grade-specific. So they can demonstrate their knowledge in different ways and still get credit for it.
Thank you. Basically, about 40% of our students seem to be getting 1s and 2s. And so according to New York State, those students are not proficient. Are 40% of our students really not doing acceptably well? And do their grades on their report cards align with the Common Core standards, or do we still have a predomination of A's and B's, which would be 4 and 5s on our report cards, while the kids are getting 1 and 2s on the exam? And which is a better indicator of future success?
Okay. So how long do we have now? Yeah, okay. So I would say, no, 40% of our children are not proficient. As we saw with the NWEA data, it's definitely much higher than that. Again, it's important to keep in mind the tests are timed. So there's no doubt in my mind that more than likely, many of our children who achieve a level 1 or a level 2, it's not a matter of them not being able to read on grade level or even above, or be able to compute mathematics or problem solve. It's just with the limited amount of time, some children take more time. As adults, if we all took a test right now, it might take me longer to do to answer a particular type of question. It might take you shorter time, and vice versa. So I think the timing issue is definitely an issue for many children. I think the other part of it is sometimes, when we look at 3rd graders as compared to 8th graders, there are things that are just developmental, and it just takes time for children to be able to acquire that. So as far as the report cards, you asked, are they aligned with the Common Core? We have not revisited the report cards yet. As you know, last year we spent a good amount of time looking at curriculum, doing professional development, looking at alignment with the Common Core. We have not yet revisited our report cards.
Thank you. Again, I would say that if the timing and developmental nature of the tests are not appropriate, that lends them a lack of validity to the testing. I'd like to see at some point a breakdown between level 1 and level 2 and between level 3 and level 4, because if level 1 is really at risk of not graduating, I would like to, know what percentage of people that is, and if that ties in with our graduation rate as they exit school. And those would certainly be the people that we would hope to provide supports to if we need to. So at some point, it doesn't have to be anytime soon, and I'm sure you're looking at that, but I'd like to see that as a board member. It says in level 2 that the students are meeting the current graduation requirements. But when these kids graduate, there will be new graduation requirements. So they're not necessarily going to meet those new graduation requirements. They're only meeting the graduation requirements as of now.
So 2022 is the magic year. So 2022 is when the graduating class of 2022 will be the children who will have had all Common Core instruction, from elementary all the way up through high school. As you know, the transition to the Common Core at the high school level began last year with the English Regent examination and also the algebra examination. This year, the geometry examination will be Common Core. So the transition is happening as we speak, but 2022 is the magic year.
I'm getting near the end. Do you believe that there was any effect on our overall performance grades due to the number of children who opted out?
So we did look at the opt-out. I can tell you that it may be a contributing factor. I can tell you that for grade 7 ELA, for example, we had, let me go back to my data if you give me a minute. I actually did write it down. As an example, Larry, on the grade 7 ELA, we had 64 students who opted out, and 30% of them, when I looked at their performance for the prior year, 30% of them were levels 3 and 4. So from grade to grade it varies, but the opt-out definitely did have an impact on performance. If we had all of the children taking the exam, I feel pretty optimistic in saying that our results would have been even higher.
That was my just, seat of the pants observation, so I just wanted to get your opinion on it. I'm getting near the end. You said that the tests are more difficult. Is that always better? And will that help our college acceptance rates and our college retention rates to make the tests harder?
So we know that the whole, race to the top movement, the whole reform movement that we're still kind of in the midst of is really about college and career ready. I think if we take the testing out of the equation and we look at the skills that are required to do well on them, and we look at the type of questioning that we now have to have in our instruction, and I think we've said it before, it's really about critical thinking and problem solving. It's really about being able to read and draw conclusions, not based on a hunch, not based on opinion, but based on evidence to support your thinking. Writing arguments, presenting arguments, counter arguments, which we know is really what college life is all about. Is it better in the long term? I think only time will tell, but I don't think there's any harm in teaching at a higher level. I don't think there's any harm in helping children to know how to think rather than what to think.
Since there are constructive responses and little short essays, is handwriting a factor in how students are graded? Because certainly when I took a test in third grade, you could not read, if I took a test today and had to write it, you couldn't read it, so you'd have no idea of whether or not I knew the material.
So handwriting is not counted. However, if a student has a very illegible handwriting and you cannot decipher what that student wrote, then certainly it's a factor.
My last question, you said that there's a strong correlation between the NWEA and the New York State tests, but yet on the NWEA, do we show 40% of our students being non-proficient? And if not, then is there a correlation because, or are the state tests just not properly skewed and not properly aligned to world standards, and they're making them artificially difficult just for political reasons?
So the NWEA, they are normed for fall, winter, and spring. And there are different RIT scores that are identified by grade level. Again, beginning of the grade, middle of the grade, and the end of the grade. I think it's important to keep in mind, and their linking study did show a strong correlation between the two. However, unlike the state exams, the NWEA is not per se a timed test. It's timed in the sense that for children in grades 3 and up, on average, it takes 45 minutes to an hour to complete a test. For the younger children, it's lesser. The other difference is that the NWEA assessments are adaptive, meaning that if I am a 4th grade student, I sit at the computer. Depending on how I answer the first question, the next question will be either progressively harder or less difficult. If I got the question correct, I will get a harder question. If I don't get the question correct, I get an easier question. It is designed for children to get 50% correct, 50% incorrect. It's also based on an equal interval scale, which the New York State exams are not based on.
If they're correlated, then is there any purpose to giving both?
Well, I mean, they serve different purposes. NWEA is not mandated. However, RTI is, response to intervention, is mandated. And so part of that requirement is that you have a universal screener. And so NWEA happens to be our universal screener that helps us to identify, not only children who may be at risk, but children who are also doing exceptionally well and can be enriched. But it does also provide data for the classroom teachers that can help them to differentiate. It does identify skill areas that either individual children or groups of children or as a district that we're doing well in, and then areas that we can enhance upon. So they serve two different purposes.
And if I could just
Thank you.
answer on the...
I just want to thank WAFA because they were very good answers, and I appreciate all of the help, and I'm done.
I'm sorry, just on the state exams, the park exams are not like out of the mix here. I don't know that they'll be put in place for 15, 16, but the park exams are designed similar to the NWA exams, which means that, the students work to the questions of their level. And the districts, we have some neighboring districts who piloted the test, who felt that some of the technical aspects of it were problematic, but the test itself was a much better test. And if the state actually did move to, say, the park assessments, they'd probably have a stronger, more effective testing program. So just to...
Thank you.
Okay, my turn. I want to go back to some of the slides if we can, because some of those we didn't get, and I think these were some of the more illustrative ones, and in particular, the two-year comparison slides. Is it possible to put those up on the board? Because, Wafa, you said you wanted to give an explanation as to 7th grade, the comparisons. So yeah, if you want to do that now, that was directly from the comparison slides. Hopefully we'll be able to see them. I don't, could you give your explanation? Oh, sorry.
So as I mentioned earlier, throughout the state of New York, the seventh grade ELA was by far the lowest. In fact, for New York State, when we get the slide up, only 29% of seventh graders in New York State achieved proficiency and levels 3 and 4. We were at 49%, so we were, although, it's not great, we were 20 percentage points above New York State. In Nassau County, seventh grade again was the lowest for the ELA, so only 38% of children throughout Nassau County achieved levels 3 and 4 on it. Okay. Yeah. Negligible. Not at all, not at all. I think in some cases, in order for it to be statistically significant, it needs to be 10 percentage points or higher. So in some cases, you saw that we had about 15 percentage points above. In other cases, we had maybe 2 or 3 percentage points. Yeah. Well, I think as we continue to teach, and align to the Common Core, I think as our children move through the grades and become more comfortable with the exams. Now, assuming that New York State does not again change the scales, and that they don't change the exams. But as Dr. Mooney mentioned, if the PARCC assessments kick in, then it'll be a whole different ballgame again. Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, they're technically international because the NWEA mean score is for every child in the country and outside the country that takes the NWEA. I think so. I can't name all the countries that participate in it, but I can say NWEA is internationally benchmarked. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I don't have that data. Mm-hmm. That we looked at, yes. Okay. So There are actually reports in Data Warehouse. That's one of the data systems that we have, and that the data actually is input by BOCES. They now have a new report where they give you districts, but again, neighboring districts, and their results, so you're able to compare to. They don't account, they really don't. Not at all. Not at all. Again, because we're a North Shore district, we get compared to these districts. No, they do not take other variables into account. That is not, no, not at all. No, they're strictly looking at performance levels, 1, 2, 3, 4. I could go to the district, these districts, I could look up their prior report cards, the New York State report cards, which are, available to the public, and they do provide a breakdown of demographics, sure.
Most of my questions were covered, but I just have a couple of questions. The slide that's up on the board now, I must be just missing something, but where do we see the results of that as to how we did compared to the neighboring districts? Did you show? I don't know if you showed that or not.
No, I did not. I actually do have the chart, but in trying to keep the presentation, from going on for an hour and a half, I'd be happy to provide that in the board packets. I do have charts where you can clearly see the performance of each of the neighboring districts in relation to ours.
I think, and I'm sorry, I just want to speak to that just a little bit also. I understand that everyone's very interested. How do we compare with, Roslyn and Manhasset and our neighbors? You have to remember, too, that we haven't talked about it too much, but the student refusals were a factor, and some of those districts had more student refusals than we did. So, whether that then resulted in us outperforming them, I think it's just in the question of similar districts, we compare ourselves, typically we've compared ourselves to our neighbors because that's just typically when we do our budget presentations and we're comparing, budget to budget, those are districts that we do look at. The formulas, I'm just going to say, the formulas for trying to do some of these calculations on growth scores and things like that, the way that the state does the comparisons, it's almost incomprehensible. I really don't know how else to describe it in terms of how they define and look at these different demographic issues and things like that. So we felt, because this year, and I really do have to commend Dr. Westervelt and our principals and our teachers. Number one, because they've really looked very extensively at their data. We're trying to make sense out of it. Trying to make sense out of this year's data is definitely more challenging than in years past for many of the reasons that have already been discussed. The comparisons are really, very difficult. So we just felt it was important to talk about really where we are, to be honest about the incremental gains that we're seeing. We want to see more. We want to perform stronger, and we do really believe that all the infrastructures that we have now put in place for curriculum and professional development, those are the things ultimately that will make a difference, but it is going to take some time. So again, do we outperform our neighboring districts? Not, in some cases, yes, more so than last year, but the comparisons are questionable. That's a fair, honest answer. So to get into the details of it I don't know how productive that necessarily is.
We're trying to get some sort of apples-to-apples comparison.
Well, it's probably, I don't know how we could, because of other variables that happened last year that hadn't, the level of student refusals, for example, on exams is something that was really not as much a factor the year before. So that is a variable in all of this.
I just want to say, I understand that. I just really wasn't sure when I looked at the packet, and I mean, I saw the caveat that, you know, even though they're comparable, they're not, what does comparable really mean? I just wasn't sure if I somehow missed it. Just also quickly, and I think you might have said part of this before, why the science scores in 4th and 8th grade do we outperform or own performance as compared to the ELA and the math?
The exams are completely different. With the science, both 4 and 8, there is a performance part where children actually go into the lab, and they have different stations. For example, there's a weighing station, there's a measurement station, so that's part of it. So there's a performance task that you don't see on the ELA and the math. And then there is a written component, but the range of scores for levels 1, 2, 3, and 4 are very, very different for the science than they are for the ELA and math. As I mentioned before, the ELA now with the Common Core alignment, it is very, very heavy in science and social studies content that may or may not be grade specific. The 4th grade science exam is very much skills based. The 8th grade science exam is very much content based. But again, the way that they're scored, the tasks that the children have to complete are drastically different, and the range of scores are different. So, for example, what is a level 4 on an ELA is not necessarily what is a level 4 on the science.
Just want to thank you very much for the presentation.
Again, thank you very much. Just a couple quick things. When you look at the trend, the ELA is statistically, when we benchmark against the state, we're pretty flat, or the variance across from 3 to 8 is very consistent. Yet in math, in elementary school, we range from 14 to 17% better, but then we see an enormous jump in middle school to where, in fact, in 7th grade, we're at 75%, the state is at 33%. I think there was a similar comparison the year before where obviously there's something going on in 7th grade over Weber, but would we now envision, due to the unified math program, that the 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade scores, we should start to see that trend more towards what we could envision as a unified program at Weber, which could be one of the driving factors in leading to the huge jump in numbers? I don't know if that's the reason behind it, but there is a huge statistical difference between middle school and elementary in math.
Well, that is definitely our hope, that as there's uniformity in approaches, uniformity in using mathematical language, certainly that is our hope, that by the time the children get into Weber, that we have seen continued progress over time. It's also important to keep in mind that elementary teachers teach everything. They teach math, ELA, science, social studies, whereas when you get to the middle school level, certainly by 7th grade, you have content area experts. So 7th grade math teachers are math teachers. That is their background. That is what they teach. That is the only thing they teach. So, you know, haven't been an elementary teacher myself, I know how difficult it is to try to teach all the subject areas and to really become an expert in every one of them. But through the professional development, the support, the teachers, God bless them, many of them on their own, they're reading, they're researching, they're doing a lot of work on their own to, to stay up to par.
Just also, given the 2-year numbers of 1 and 2s, and the fact that we then have to intercede at that point, have we determined at all the cost of the added AIS or however your academic intervention, and then taking it sort of backwards? And I'll apologize for asking this. If we were to do things sooner as a district, going all the way back to pre-K, are there ways that we think, if we imagine that it's $10 to fix something in third, fourth, and fifth grade, and we could do things for $3 earlier, have we, and I know it's an enormous undertaking, but have we started to even brainstorm one day about what we could do as a community at the $3 level to help us as we move kids through the longer term?
I mean, just to answer the one question about the AIS, in terms of cost, I think one of the ways we would measure any possible increased cost did we have to hire additional staff to address the needs of the children, and we have not. So we always work to support our students. Our teachers use very creative scheduling and structuring, and we do look at also, it's not just the test, the state test score, that is a big factor, obviously, in a child being eligible for AIS, but we look at their NWE scores. We try to use multiple measures to determine the appropriate level of intervention for various students. Some students simply may not be very good test takers, and so resulted in maybe a 1 or a 2. So we have to take that next to the child who truly requires some more specialized intervention. So we do really look at all that. So for the time being, I can say we haven't seen an increased cost, at least based on staffing. We hope that will not, change. Yes, exactly. I know that Dr. Westervelt, one of the curriculum goals this year is to work with both our universal pre-Ks and the pre-K program to work with a more consistent curriculum. That is one of the ways to address with early intervention. I think maybe that's what you're trying to get at, and to the extent possible that we can reach out and work with families as early as possible. We do try to do that. We are, our charge is K-12. So, and we all support and understand the need and impact of early intervention. So, we're always looking for ways. I think we want to strengthen also our primary grades because it speaks to the same issue, that if we can address the needs of children, the academic needs of children early on, then maybe we can offset some of the issues we'll see later on. So we always try to coordinate our efforts, and we'll continue to do that.
Wow, Dr. Westervelt. Two questions. One is, a while ago in the curriculum committee, I remember seeing a presentation. It was similar in terms of 3s and 4s combined. And then there was another presentation we saw that we broke out the 3s and 4s, and we noticed there was a big difference. Again, when we compare to other districts or other ways that you're looking at these 3 and 4 splits. And unfortunately, it wasn't a good comparison because we found that, our 3s plus 4 cohort was stronger in all these areas that we were showing. But when we looked at our 4 versus 3 split inside the 3-4 cohort, it wasn't as positive. Is it something that we have to worry about, or are we concerned about it? And what are your thoughts?
Well, I did look at, I don't have it with me. I did take a look at percentages at level 4, because I know that was important for you and other board members. In many cases, we actually had an increase in the percent of children who achieved a level 4. So even though we saw incremental progress, in most of the grade levels, we actually saw higher percentages of level 4, not across the board. And again, I'd be happy to provide that chart. I know I have it somewhere either in here or on my desk. I'd be happy to provide that where you can see the specifics.
And then my other last question is, do we as a community, as a district, have any idea how lucky we are to have you as a superintendent, assistant superintendent in the school? I think the answer is yes. Yes. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Is everyone looking? I just wanted to add, Vernon kind of stole what I was going to say, but I just wanted to say how impressed I am. And in all the years I've been sitting up here, I've never been able to hear a report like this that was so comprehensive and thorough, and you so clearly know what is going on and why it's happening and exactly what is happening and how it affects our students and our staff. And while we might not agree with everything that is coming down the pike, we are doing what we need to do to stand behind and support our students and our staff, and we're so fortunate to have you. And I think we're in very good hands. And under the leadership of you and Dr. Mooney, I feel very, very much more confident than I have in what we're doing here, even if it's not the same confidence that I have in state ed. But thank you very much for the presentation. And now I believe we will move on to committee reports, policy and personnel.
I'm going to keep this kind of short. We had a meeting on September 19th. There's the minutes are posted on the website. Our next meeting will be on October 24th, and that will be in the annex at 8:30. So hope we see many of you there. We had a lively discussion at our last meeting, and hopefully we will continue to discuss the issues. Thanks.
Budget and facilities?
We met last week, was it? Or the week before last? I know. We touched on a number of topics, including the bond. Not much to report there. The next meeting is the 14th of October at 8:30. It's a Tuesday instead of the normal Monday. And the focus will be the 15-16 budget and the hole we are in.
Okay, on that cheery note, curriculum.
Curriculum, we met last on September 12th, and we discussed our goals going forward. And we're meeting again on October 17th, and we're going to be talking about the educational requirements or the educational aspects of the proposed bond, and that's at 8:30 in the morning, also at the Daly Center.
Thank you. I'm going to move to the action items and move items A1 through D8. Do I have a second? Ms. Nadolny, all in favor? 7-0. Thank you very much. And now I will go to old business. Do we have any old business? New business.
This is a topic that's going to generate some controversy, and it's already been the subject of much discussion, and we feel the community should know a little bit about it. Sorry. There's a proposal that is passed through the State Education Department that will require any school district that has more than 20 children in any grade who are English language learners to provide full bilingual education. And this is one of the issues that I was touching on when I was speaking with respect to the auditor's report. Districts with how should we say, very not homogeneous districts where we have a lot of different people from a diverse population will be subject to these requirements starting in 2015, 2016. Now, for Port Washington now, if Dr. Mooney, if I'm correct, that will necessitate at least a few Spanish teachers for full bilingual education in 2015. This is another unfunded mandate that will force us to spend money where we're not getting any help from the state. There are also other languages that also may be implicated. Now, no one on this board wants to deprive a child of education. What we do object, or what I object to, and I think there's considerable pressure being put on Albany from our elected representatives, is to force these mandates on us at the same time we're having a tax cap and we have no assistance on this. This is going to punch another hole in our budget. It's not a huge hole, But right now, our estimates are around $250,000 to comply with this mandate in 2015, 2016. Now, this is something that speaking for myself personally, if you have a problem with this, or if you like to research this, it's on the state education website. The law is about 60 pages, or the regs are 60 pages long. It's another issue that is basically passed by the Regents Committee fairly quickly. The state was supposed to have a meeting, or the State Education Department, with our elected representatives, including our Assemblywoman Michelle Schimmel, last Friday. The state canceled that abruptly without reason and has not given a rescheduled date. We have made overtures to our representatives, and we urge members of the community to ask the state, if you're going to push these onerous items on us, give us help. We can't continue to do this and pay these fees while we're under a tax cap regime. Larry was asking before whether or not the ratio of increased expenses is sustainable. This is but another example of why, in my opinion, and others I would bet, it's not. And something has to be done to reverse this. So that's just something I throw up to the community, because it is a recent development, and this is a different development than English as a second language. This is full bilingual education, and this has other implications. It's not just that. If you have classes with various languages and you have to basically gather students in one particular class, it's not just the teachers we have to hire, it's busing, because we have to move children to create these classes. This is a potentially disastrous type of act for other districts. I mean, can you imagine what it's going to do to districts in Queens, where you may have dozens of languages in a single district? The burden could be enormous. And it's interesting, because if you look at our district compared with our similar districts that we had on the board with Dr. Westervelt gave a presentation, I don't think some of those districts may have the same concerns, or not concerns, but same issues that we're facing, or we're likely to face if this regulation is enforced by the state to the maximum. So that's just an issue that I have, and I throw it out to the community and for comments, and for the board as well.
Yeah, I agree with everything Bill said, and I'd like to look at it from a different way too. According to what I understand, 100% of our ESL students graduate. So I'm not sure that bilingual education would give us any better graduation rates against our students who don't speak English, because I don't think we can graduate 115% of them. The other issue I have a problem with is we are now going to be making classes that are going to have a larger percentage of students who English is a second language for in it, which is going to socially put them in. We spent a long time trying to integrate everybody into our programs and into our school, and this is going to actually be much more segregated and much more, I don't think necessarily in the best social or educational interest of the kids, besides that from an educational standpoint, whether or not they gave us the money. So I'm not, one thing I'd like to know, and I don't expect the answer today, but I know that Dr. Westervelt has experience in this area with some of the other districts she's worked in, is whether or not, if this was a totally free program, would we want to do it for our children if we were not being forced to, or is the program that we currently have doing a better job? And again, I'll throw it out to you. I mean, if you say I'd like to do this, then that would be great. But so I'd sort of like to get some clarification on that, because if we're going to ask for a waiver, if we're going to fight this or anything else, we want to know we have an educational as well as an economic reason for doing so.
I just would like to point out, I know the board knows this, but for the entire community, that Dr. Mooney and Dr. Westervelt were on top of this the minute that there was any whisper, anything about it. They tried to get neighboring communities on board and other communities all through Long Island, and not too many people were all that interested. And I think that speaks to the fact that it is going to affect us a great deal more than it is going to affect other communities. But it's important to know that our administration is guiding us in the right direction and stepping out as soon as these things arise. So I think clearly they do not support it, and I think we will try to go down the path of applying for any kind of waiver, but we've talked about waivers for things in the past because our district is more successful than other districts in doing certain things, and we haven't been successful in getting the waivers. It's still worth the effort, but it's just important to know that it's not usually a very successful path. Chris?
We just need the tools.
Chris?
Well, I was actually going to applaud Dr. Westfeld and Dr. Mooney for actually being on top of it early on, and also kind of reiterate what Larry was saying, more or less, that I really would like to know how well our system works, how well our thing works, because if we don't have 20 kids in one grade, we still need to have those services available for them. So it's not like we have bilingual education for every single grade. It might be grade 3 and grade 7 that we need it. So we still have like a lot, it's like a patchwork of different programs that have to be moved through the grades and everything. So it's not an ideal situation in any manner. So I myself would like to see how well our program works. With 100% graduation rate, I mean, you can't really argue with that. So that would be more or less my request.
I share the concerns, but I'm also very troubled by this as it pertains to the overall community, because how this rolls out will, to some degree, pit resident against resident, and you will have people, depending on how isolated or integrated a program we can compile, you will have non-English language learner parents who object to their children perhaps having their day interrupted by bilingual education, which will then cause a backlash against the people who are causing bilingual education within the community. And so there can be a lot of subtle side effects that this has that we as a board and a community have to be aware of and do whatever we can to avoid that, because there's already several double standards that exist in Port Washington, and this will just compound it, because I think it will send a lot of people over the edge if their kids come home saying, oh yeah, we just sat there for 2 hours while such and such went on. And so it really is a slippery slope in a whole number of ways outside of even the financial costs.
The administration agrees with all of this, which is why not only Dr. Westervelt and myself, but Shirley Sapiro, our ESL director, and Christine Vasilev, the PWTA president, we took it to the highest levels that we possibly could, at least to voice our concerns. They were not really heeded in any way. We are currently assessing the implications of implementing these regulations, and we will certainly be coming back to the board with at least, if complying, what exactly does this look like for us, and then we can have a better sense of what for staffing and programmatic issues. Clearly, the most troubling aspect of the way that this particular change in mandate was basically handed down is that it's telling us it is taking away some local control in terms of educational program and pedagogy, and that is really going much deeper than we've experienced before. The testing program is one thing, Common Core Standards is something, but this goes much, much deeper to us educationally, and we share all the concerns. We've been a very, very active voice. Unfortunately, some of the other districts jumped on a little bit too late after they realized what was really happening, but we were the model, and they used us as the model. And ironically, Port Washington is often viewed as the model ESL program, where our neighboring districts have come to us, and our ESL director has visited those programs to offer them ways to improve the instruction that they provide to some of their growing populations in this area. So it's a very frustrating place to be, and we're, whatever support we can get, and we will certainly be working on it ourselves to understand the implications and bringing that back. So,
Thank you. And thank Mr. Hohauser for bringing that up for new business this evening. And now we have our last opportunity for the community to be heard. I ask again for you to identify yourself for the record and know there's a 3-minute limit.
Howard Simon. Just very quickly, first off, on the assessment questions, leaving aside the, let's call it the political discussion of whether we believe the tests have intrinsic or inherent value, or our belief in what Mark Twain or Benjamin Disraeli, take your pick, said about statistics, we can have to take a hard look at the fact that the numbers do and can tell us something. But when we look at the figures that tell us, for example, how the 2014 8th graders did compared to the 2013 8th graders, I would posit perhaps a more telling number to look at would be how the 2014 8th graders do compared to the 2013 7th graders. That's the cohort that would tell us, are they becoming more proficient as they move through the system or not? That might be something worth looking at, because regardless of whether we believe in the inherent value, those are data points which can be instructive. And if we can pull out, as I believe Dr. Westervelt said she did, and tell us specifically how the students who opted out did a year ago, then we can also pull out how the students who opted in did a year ago and know whether or not they are improving or not. And those are potentially useful data points, because at least it is consistent. We may not like the background, but it's consistent. And everybody else in all the other districts is playing by the same rules. That said, I think the larger issue from this evening, and it's been hinted at repeatedly, I think Mr. Hohauser brings it up brilliantly with the English language bilingual education situation. Mr. Greenstein brought it up as well. End of the day, we can talk all we want about test scores, we can talk all we want about programs, but if the amount of money we have to spend each year continues to outstrip the amount of money we can raise each year, we're soon not going to have much else to talk about. That's really the bottom line, to put it bluntly. We can talk about whether or not they are real figures long run of liabilities, but the fact is we do have liabilities. And if the expenses continue to grow faster than our ability to meet those expenses,
30 seconds.
all these discussions are going to be moot. And I'm not quite sure where the solutions are going to come from. But I'd much rather we as a community spend more time talking about those solutions than arguing over the potential value of test scores. Just something to keep in mind. Thank you.
If there are no other community comments at this time, we're adjourned. Thank you.